Okay,
It is going.
now it's going.
All right. All right. If you like trying to get at the roots of astrology, you'll like it tonight. Otherwise, it's going to be tedious, and it might be tedious even if you like getting at the roots of astrology. We're beginning to discuss tests number 5 through 10, which are the opportunity tests. And when we do this, we leave the world of psychology, including depth psychology, because psychology has nothing to say about having opportunities in the world. It can tell us how we fit ourselves to participate in the world, but not about any kind of inherent opportunities that we might have. Now, some psychologists do give aptitude tests, but aptitude is something different. Aptitude tells us how likely we are to succeed at something like mechanics or languages or gardening or something like that. But aptitude tests will not tell us if we have opportunities to apply any aptitude we have. Sociologists can tell us how likely we are to find opportunities in life because of our social background, our education, our IQ, and things like that. But their predictions are mostly statistical, and they're not specific to an individual. Now, mystics, if they are well developed, and sometimes even psychics, can give very exact information about opportunities, except that the psychics are not always reliable. About 53 years ago, when I first started studying spiritual things, I knew a man. I was living in Tucson at the time, and his name was Bill Schenefeld. And his cousin was a traveling representative for the Rosicrucian Fellowship. He was a clairvoyant and reputed even to be an initiate. And he would give talks all over. He would either advertise talks or would be invited to give talks, and that's what his life was. Sometimes after the talks were over, he would entertain questions, any kind of question you wanted to ask. And Bill told me, he said, this is not an uncommon thing that someone would say to him or ask him the question, am I likely to get a job? And he would pause for a second and he'd say, well, if you go to such and such place next Tuesday, you'll have a job for yourself. Now, that's much more a matter of clairvoyance than it is astrology. I don't even know if the man studied astrology. But it does indicate that the person asking the question had a destiny with employment that he carried inside of himself. In this regard, astrology is called the clock of destiny. So when we're looking at a horoscope, we're looking at a map of destiny for this lifetime. So if we want to begin to understand the houses, we have to look a little bit at destiny. Destiny is not fate. Fate might be called an ineluctable destiny, that you've put yourself in such a place that you can't escape. For the most part, destiny is a living collection of past causes. And some of those past causes are eventual consequences. And some of those past causes are opportunities. So we have made a destiny for ourselves to have opportunities. So what we do is what we become. And the way we do it defines the kind of character we have. Because the experience is rich in qualities, and those qualities get built right into us. Destiny associated with cardinal signs in astrology is often called instantaneous destiny. Being instantaneous, it means that there is, as much as possible, a cause and consequence event. You put your hand in the fire and you get burned. It's immediate. Cardinal sign destiny is sometimes referred to pay-as-you-go destiny. So cause and consequence are a living, moving thing of which you're pretty much aware. It's not something that ambushes you when you're not ready. You step on the head of the rake. I did it yesterday, but I was able to block with my hand. I went into the tool shed. I'm looking for something, and I stepped on the head of the hole, and it came up, and I had my hand up like that. But you get bopped in the head. So this kind of character, that is this destiny, is good for initiating things. So cardinal sign destiny is often called initiatory destiny. But sometimes we initiate things whose consequences go beyond the moment. And they get out of hand. Sometimes it's because of intensity, and sometimes it's because of lack of planning or whatever, but they get out of hand. In such cases, the consequences of a path of action, if the consequence is unpleasant, one would like to be able to change. So you want to change the path of activity before it becomes something terrible. You can't do that with a hole because it's right there. It's immediate. Ships at sea do this all the time. They call it correcting. You know, it's steering a naval vessel, a very large ship, is not an easy thing to do. And before they had GPS systems, they would, several times a day, they would have to either use LORAN, or before that they had to use reckoning from the stars. And then they would do a correction to put themselves on course from where they were, not necessarily it was the intended place in the first place. So this kind of corrective activity requires a different kind of consciousness than the kind of consciousness that's involved in the action only. And that consciousness is a consciousness of being able to vary things. And that variable kind of consciousness is usually associated with common signs or mutable signs. Sometimes mutable destiny is called service destiny because it shifts action from self-satisfaction to service of something other than yourself, because that's often the means to correct it all. Common signs are not usually distinguished for the quality of reliability. They are the signs of excuses, and they like excuses as much as they like theoretical solutions. So they're not always adamant about responsibility. It's always, for the common sign, it's always seen the destinies in the future, and I have the means to change things before they become critical. So consequently, not all cardinal action is corrected, even though there may be many repeated opportunities to correct it. That's one of the qualities of the common signs. They repeat things. Yeah, they're very good at repeating things, almost to a mania. But sometimes they repeat things until they're ground in. And that results in a different kind of destiny. It results in a destiny that is pretty much determined. And it becomes an immutable kind of destiny. It's not totally immutable, but for the most part, yes. And when that happens, you have a fixed sign kind of destiny. Fixed sign destiny is fundamental. One doesn't go on or move on until one gets the fundamental that's involved. And when you get it and you're right at the basis of things, then you can go forward. Now, it's not insuperable, but it appears so because our power of will and our strength of character and our soul power are pretty feeble. And so at times it seems that it is unimmutable. So the fixed signs then are about rudiments, about the basics. You have to get back to the basics. And if you want to go forward, you can't do it until you get the basics first. Now, if a person's consciousness is deep and it's sure, the destiny in question can be used in a different way. It can be used to probe the fundamentals of the universe. So fixed sign destiny is very good for understanding fundamentals of the world altogether. So it can be something like a patient researcher or something like that. So we see then a person of action. But suppose that action gets stopped or gets out of hand as something like temper. Then it produces things like you'd like to take your words back, or you'd like to take your swinging your fist back, or all of those sorts of things, and you can't do it. But you can make it up to the world, or you can make it up to a person if you've harmed a person, and that's service kind of destiny. Suppose you acted in anger and murdered someone when they were a younger person, and they were deprived of the opportunity to be educated. So in a future rebirth, you would have the opportunity to educate them at great sacrifice to yourself, to educate them and give them what they lost because of your rash action. However, if you don't do it, and you dilly-dally around because responsibilities like that are too onerous, then what happens is it becomes a fixed kind of destiny. Now, those are some examples of that. Now, this is something that can be seen in other ways, because it is, astrology there isn't only one way to do things. But if you take note about what we've been talking about for the past few minutes, it's been more about signs than it has been about houses. It's good for seeing how destiny develops and flows, but we want to know more of the opportunities that are produced in destiny. So we want to go into opportunities, and that means houses. But before we do that, we have to do one more thing. I told you it's a tedious night. And that is that novelty has to be brought in. Destiny is not some kind of a machine. It is not deterministic. until you pull the trigger, there are options. Sometimes when you pull the trigger, you no longer have options. But as you can see in the example we just had, there are opportunities to correct it, to make it up. So it's not just an elaborate system of causes and consequences that goes on, and that we're stuck in that elaborate system of cause and consequences and are conscious of it and can't do anything about it. That would be trapped. It would be like being on a treadmill. Being on a treadmill that you knew you were on, but you had no way of shutting it off or no way of getting off. We recognize that the fact of the matter is that we are free to introduce new things. All of the things that we mentioned in the previous example were things that were done by free choice. We are divine beings, and divine beings are creative, and we exist within and we transcend the realm of cause and consequence. And from that vantage, we can introduce new things. And if we're creative, we can bring in creative new things. And then the cause and consequence becomes creative feedback. This is not just a matter of what we do if we're painting a picture or something like that. It amounts to our life. We can creatively find ways to change situations in life so that it's better from everyone. So anything in life, including life itself, can be lived completely creatively. And that's living a very divine life, because you're spontaneously making something new all the time. A free person is someone who is not away from life. A free person is a person who does everything in life by freely willing to do it. Now, when we have this in mind, we can see the houses as gateways to freedom. Freedom to do things voluntarily, to do something new, to find new opportunities, or to take opportunities and use them in a way that they've never been used before. The sad thing is that most of us do not live this way. Most of us have no choice because we haven't broadened our interests, or we haven't looked for new things or tried to develop something new. We're sort of like people who have been capable of seeing new things, but we sort of shuttered the windows. And we've done it by habit. We fall into habit, and we don't move out in a new way. Fortunately, the way it works is that the evolutionary creation in the macrocosm is such that we are almost forced to do new things, because the conditions of the world around us and the cosmos itself are always changing. And if we want to continue on, we have to change according to the way the world changes. Now, if we do try new things, when we first try them, we're a little bit timid. We're a little bit tentative about it. I can remember the first time that in the physics department that we installed the, what is now, you don't even see it, it's all underneath, but the ability to, it's called Telnet, where you can talk to another computer. And it was an electrical engineer that tried it first, and he was really tentative. He didn't know whether this was going to work or not. And that's a very good example of what happens. After we do something for a while, after we've had a few go-arounds at it, we get the gist of it. As we advance, we become capable and functional in working from ideas and principles instead of only by experiences. That we can have new things come about because in theory we understand the principle of what's going on in the world. But when we do try to take theoretical things and put them into practice, things get very complicated. We'll take something really abstract, mathematics. Now in math, we can come to a principle, a theorem, in many different ways. You can prove a theorem a number of ways. The most famous is the different kinds of proof for the theorem of Pythagoras. And there have been loads of them, including one that is a very unique, a very simple, but never before produced by a president of the United States. I think it was James Garfield, I'm not certain. But when he had spare time or in his free time in the White House, he would do mathematics, abstract mathematics. If you've ever studied mathematics, you know that mathematical principles can be expressed in various different forms. You can say the same thing in trigonometry as you can in analytic geometry. But no matter what form it's expressed in, it's still the same truth. It's when abstract math meets concrete application that things get complicated. Because there may be one truth capable of different ways of being proven, but that one proof can be used in the creation in many, many different ways. There's almost an infinite number of applications to any principle. And this is the same thing that is true for physics or chemistry. Even some of the arts are like that. And it's like that with the mundane houses in astrology. They are ideas, and they are ideas that have many different applications. And the applications depend upon the freedom and the creativity of the native. For some people, the second house means only income. There's nothing more creative about it. So in this way, the horoscope, which is in one way of looking at it a mathematical symbol, we carry it around with us. It's right in us. It's right in our cells from the first breath that we took. And we carry our opportunities right with us. They're not attitudes like the signs are. They're opportunities. We have certain attitudes about certain kinds of opportunities, but the opportunities are there to see and be utilized in the world. And that's where interpretation comes in. And it's the work of an astrologer to determine how limited or how unlimited the native is to seeing and taking advantage of opportunities. You don't want to tell them to look in such and such place to do this if they can't even see that. Now, it's a psychological work, but it's not a work that psychologists much do. Now, as all of you can tell by now, that I'm struggling in trying to get the whole idea of how houses mesh into the world and what is the fundamental basis of houses in astrology. I'm struggling. This is something that almost no astrologers do. It isn't necessary to be able to do astrology, just as it isn't necessary to know mechanics and engineering to drive a car. But if you do know mechanics and engineering, you can get much more out of a car, and you can not do it harm if you know much more about it. So I'm spending a lot of time on trying to get to the roots of houses in this talk, and later on there's going to be even more emphasis on houses than there has been in any of the courses that have preceded this. This is because knowledge of houses in a deep way is important to practical astrology. Anybody can see what kind of an attitude somebody has with very simple astrology, but how to apply that attitude through the houses is not so easy. So we're going to be looking at a lot of housework, if you want to look at it that way. If the course continues, if it's going to be just 4 of us all the time, that's going to be hard for me. Okay, let's give it another try to get at what the houses are. The mundane houses of the horoscope can be seen as derivatives from the signs. This is a way of applying the principle of analogy that pervades the cosmos on all levels. Now, in this, we're assuming that all of us are divine human beings, and that what we're doing here is a creative work, not just an experiential thing, but a creative work, and that this is our proving ground. And this is where we get the joy of fulfilling our creation. It's a purposeful way of looking at things, and that takes us out of the humdrum of life. I don't know how some people deal with the humdrum of life. They don't. I guess that's why they all drink and do things like that, because they don't know how to deal with the ongoing everyday. In the evolutionary creation, the spirit reflectively projects itself into the unknown. And that unknown is potential within the absolute. And that projection brings up resistance. Or you might say in the creation, it congeals matter. And that matter is the stuff of new becoming being, or new becoming spirit. The matter begins in complete ignorance and total unconsciousness. And as such, it becomes the perfect resistance. It becomes a resistance that isn't a hard resistance. It's a resistance that, because you have to control everything, otherwise it just falls apart, that's the most difficult kind of resistance that there is. But at any rate, in this resistive struggle between spirit and matter, which is the interplay of life in form, everything grows. The spirit fulfills this creative dream and realizes its power as a divine being. It does that by materializing. And the matter becomes spiritualized and transformed through the interaction and through the intelligence right within the creative dream. Now, this activity is taking place on many levels. As we're looking at it to understand the functioning of astrology in the houses in human horoscopes, the signs and the constellations are more spiritual, and the houses are more material. They're the interface. They're the nitty-grit with the external world. So in this, the signs are more about life and about qualities, and the houses are more about form. In astrology, the planets stand between the signs and the houses. On one hand, they are concentrated and condensed spiritual qualities, And on the other hand, they are forms, very definite forms with definite limitations, in fact, such definite limitations that they are specialists. Mercury is a specialist in thinking. Now, in this, we can see the houses as responsive derivatives of signs. They're mundane reflections of the intentions of the signs. For example, the attractive qualities of the sign Taurus, when they are in their derivative in the second house, might indicate the opportunities to work with materials. It could mean to amass a fortune, or it could mean to select a block of marble for the perfect statue. Now, we could do this with every sign in every house, and eventually, toward the end of this course, when we do a house-by-house analysis of each of these horoscopes, we will do this. But for now, we're seeing that the houses represent fields of opportunities, and those fields of opportunities are in the unknown, or in the realm that has to be worked out, even though they are analogous to the signs. So seeing the signs as derivatives, the houses as derivative of the signs in potential, means that we are seeing them in the realms of the unknown. You can see that from this talk. We're trying to talk about how one addresses the unknown. This means that some of the opportunities are not finished. They're more a matter of potential. Sometimes it's, like, how many times have we gone home from being in an argument saying, if I had only said that, and when you're in the moment, you don't always see it. Now, in some cases, in some horoscopes, the opportunities might be highly finished. And we can tell the querent that if he or she goes to the grocery store in Stoughton, there will be a job. In other horoscopes, we may be only able to say that it would be wise for you to look in the direction of merchandising. So, like, the opportunities are not all worked out so much. And you find different people have different consciousness in the opportunities that they carry about with them. Some are much, much more finished. For some people, there might not even be any development in opportunities for employment or income or anything like that, because they put everything they had into other things like social relationships or something like that. And for such people, it's hard for them to find a specific job. So what we're trying to get at with these different approaches and the examples in those approaches is that there is a degree of unknowing when we're working with form or matter. Because of that, the houses have to be approached with a different attitude and methodology than the signs. That attitude, if we want to be successful, must take into account the unknown. And it has to take into account potential. Now, there's nothing mysterious about this. Scientists work this way all the time. And when they don't is when they get into trouble. When they assume that they know something which they really don't know, that's where they go off on a tangent, or their scientific research is not fruitful. But if they say to themselves, well, I don't know what this is, so let me try this or this or this. This is what science does all the time. And so We're trying to come to that understanding of how people can carry around opportunities in themselves. I want to look at this all in one more way. Even though when I was doing the notes, I said to myself, this is almost like a mania, trying to look at it in different ways. It's not really a neurosis. I do have a need to know, and it's very, very important to me, and it is on the fringes of experience. And I personally have been so much of a Platonist that I've been an escapist for much of my life and never really got into material. And because of that, I missed a lot of life because, you know, for most people, what material is and what stuff is the all. And I've eschewed that in favor of the ideas and the principles, and therefore I missed a lot of experience. And so now I'm trying to make up for it. I have maybe the last 20 or 25 years. All right, let's look at one more way of looking at getting at the houses. And in this one will lead us right directly into doing the first tests and profiles. A horoscope is a two-dimensional map of the heavens from a given place at a given time. In that, it is a scientific graphic. And for the way it is used, it's pretty accurate. Various different theories are used to derive the house cusps, different mathematical theories, but the results are all fairly close to each other. And that all is moot anyway, because if you're going to do any really accurate work with astrology, you're going to have to rectify each and every cusp. Now, though the horoscope is a graphic map of the heavens, astrologers don't use it quite that way. We do not say, for example, that if a planet is 37 degrees west of the midheaven, it means such and such. Some people have tried to develop that kind of astrology, but only in the very vaguest way have they found any success. I don't think there's much future for it. So instead of doing something like that, we say that if Mars is in the 9th house, it means thus and so, or is this kind of tendency. And when we do that, we're no longer using a direct scientific application of the horoscope as a map. Even if we say that the 9th house is a derivative of the 9th sign Sagittarius. Now, some people, like very advanced mystics, can use the principle of analogy, and they literally can come to intuitive and fully conscious knowledge of what a planet in a house means in this horoscope, and they can see it by their principle of analogy that goes deep back into the spiritual worlds. But ordinary people like ourselves can't do that because we're rather dull. So we see that when we're using the horoscope this way, like saying Mars is in the 9th house, we're dealing with symbolism. And symbolism is not direct knowledge. Symbolism is indirect knowledge. Now, if a person is highly intuitive or clairvoyant, a symbol can be used to focus the intuition or the clairvoyance, and then one can see directly and then drop the symbol because the symbol is no longer necessary. In any case, we want to see whether there is any basis for non-symbolic, direct astrological influence in various areas of the heaven. It would be nice if we could find such And if we could estimate the relative significance of that kind of influence, that would be really science, and that would be something we could rest ourselves on, something that was foundational. Now, if we look at the first two tests, number 5 and number 6, each of those tests divides the heavens into two halves. The doctrine is that the astrological significators in these halves have different kinds of influence because just because of being in those halves. Now, we could take them symbolically, analogically symbolically, and we could say that these two halves are like the 6 months seasons, that the northern houses relate to the summertime and the southern houses relate to the wintertime. But that would still be symbolic. We're trying to see if there's something direct in the angle of incidence of the planets, so that we can see that there is some basis, a direct basis for the houses being what they are. Now, there's a big problem in this because astrological influence is extremely subtle. If it weren't, we would have measured it by now. The way that doctrines like this develop is from observations and recordings of observations by many different people over many years. Now, that sounds sketchy, but if we think of it, it really is not. In fact, it really is science. In science, it's called descriptive science or observational science. Each observation is that's independent of the observer is a datum. And when they are all accumulated and can be judged, if we're sensitive enough to do that, we come up with a general tendency. We can from that, we can predict that if people have a bunch of planets in such and such an area, then they'll have these qualities. Now, that usually, with astrology, has taken centuries to develop that kind of knowledge. And that's a fine thing to do, but for now, even though these talks are long, their centuries is way too long. So, since we don't have that time frame, we have to make do as well as we can. So to do that, let's take the most obvious influence available to us, the sun. Now, we may not be sensitive to all of the spiritual, very subtle influences but the sun, but the direct energetic influence of the sun makes a night and day difference. I have experienced that being at a campfire on a cold night, and if you put your front of your body toward the campfire, it's hot, and the back side is cold. And then you put your back to the campfire and you freeze from the front. But as soon as the sun rises, not only is it all different because there's so much more light, but also there's warmth because of the radiant heat that comes from the sun. So we can see that this is only energetics. It's not dealing with subtle astrological influences, but we can see that there is indeed a difference between the northern and southern hemispheres. If we look at it historically, almost all human activity until the electric light was developed had to be done in the daytime. So electricity changed the whole game. So that in itself, just the using of the sun, but with energetic instead of astrological influence, is the beginning of validation. Now, the other planets may have more or less influence, but astrological influence is not a sure thing as sunlight because it is so much more subtle. However, there's good reason to consider the profiles like this to be valid, as has been found by most astrologers. And astrology has been around for a few thousand years now. So these first tests, number 5, 6, and 7, could be called contiguous area profiles. And of all of the contiguous area profiles, this one, number 5, I have found to be the most significant. The upper hemisphere is called the southern hemisphere because the orientation of a horoscope is as though you had the North Pole at your back and you're looking south. In short, you would be, in a way, if you could be in the center of the earth, you would be crucified on the North Pole. That way, what is to the left is the eastern horizon, and what is to the right is the western horizon. Because the horizons are definite, well, you know that when the sun is up or when it's not up or when a planet pops over the horizon, it's something very definite. And that makes these two hemispheres bounded regions. If you remember a couple years ago, 3, 4, we were looking at astrological aspects, and we did a lot with looking at bounded regions. And when we did that, we said that the center or the heart of a bounded region is most significantly represents that bounded region. In this case, for the southern hemisphere, the midheaven is the heart of it. And that is in the heat of the day when everything is out in the open. So we can see then that that's the nature of the region. The northern hemisphere has the nadir in its heart, and it is clearly inward and retreative. Very few people are up all the time, even with electric lights now. Very few people are up at midnight. The initial cusp of the houses, where the houses go to, is the first house cusp. So we can see that that is an active hemisphere. And the initial cusp of the northern hemisphere is the 7th house cusp, so it is a responsive or a collective hemisphere. So once again, when we do these profiles, a 5-5 profile would indicate healthy balance of opportunities. There'd be opportunities to be in the greater microcosmic world out there where things are happening, and that would be balanced with the more personal inner hemisphere. Now, when we apply this to Sigmund Freud, we end up with a 4-6, meaning to say that there are 4 planets in the southern hemisphere and 6 in the northern hemisphere. And the one-liner that I put in the conspectus column is matter and intellect, balance, but a few more opportunities to be macrocosmic and outward. That's the one-liner I put in there. Now, that is a little deceptive because it indicates that there are a few more opportunities to be in the wide world than in the personal realm. but it's deceptive because so many planets are near the horizon, especially the western horizon. There are 3 above it, 3 right above it, and 3 right below it. This means that this is not, for north and south, this is not accentuated in northness or southness. So it's not a strong pull. If we look at it even more closely, we see that there are no planets in the 9th house or the 10th house. So, and there's only one deep beneath the earth, and that's Neptune down in the 4th house. Now, the first thing that comes to one's consciousness is the temptation to think that this profile is more balanced than it seems at first glance, because north and south are not that different. I couldn't make that conclusion, but what I do think is that these factors of having so much on the horizon damp or mute the importance of this profile. This is not like if they were all way up near the midheaven or something like that, then this would be an important profile. But since so many are not hemispherically divided that way, it is not so important. It's not, I guess you would say, to use the language that people use, it's not definitive. If we look at the Carl Jung chart, we get a 6-4. Again, 6 above, 4 below. No, 6 below, 4 above. Saturn, Neptune, Moon, Pluto, Mercury, Venus below in the northern hemisphere, and Sun, Uranus, Jupiter, and Mars above. And I made a similar line, a balance but a slight emphasis toward the microcosmic personal world. But here again, we see that there are a lot of planets near the horizon. So there is that damping or muting effect. But it's not quite so great because there are 3 planets that are deep in the northern hemisphere: Neptune, Moon, and Pluto. Now you can make all kinds of judgment calls about this or synthesis calls about this, but there's not a lot that you can get out of that. Now, looking back to when we did test number 2, which is the polarity test, we noted that Jung had a 5-5 or a 7-5 balance. And at that time, we mentioned that Carl Jung was sure that he was an introvert. The profile number 2 indicated that there was balance between introversion and extroversion. But at that time, I said that my experience was that the polarity test was not enough in itself to be the sole determiner of introversion and extroversion. Sometimes there are a lot of things that contribute to whether somebody is an introvert or an extrovert. Sometimes this test, the vertical test, can influence introversion or extroversion. Obviously, the northern hemisphere indicates planets under the earth. The deepest cusp is the cusp of the 4th, and that's a subjective inward house. So all of these are adjectives that are descriptive of introversion. And from this we can see, we can modify what we got from test number 2 and see that there are things that indicate possible introversion. We're going to run into more along the way. All right, now let's turn to test and profile number 6. The horizontal test and profile. In this profile, we're counting the number of significators in the Eastern Hemisphere and comparing them to the number in the Western Hemisphere. And let's do that by looking again at the quasi-astrological passage of the sun through the hemispheres. When we do that, we ask ourselves, is there a different quality in the opportunities from midnight to noon than there is from noon to midnight? Both are half light and both are half dark. But in society and in the work of the world, there is very definitely a difference. When the sun is in the east, there is a feeling of freshness, of vigor. The best is yet to come. You know, the restoration of night, because we're looking at the east because that's the heart of it again. You know, the restoration has come, and now there's a mounting or waxing application toward the world. And the goal is the 10th house. So what it has as its goal is to be on the top, or there's ambition. This is almost like the Knights of King Arthur. Sir Gawain would fight with increasing strength from dawn until noon, and then he would wane in strength. By afternoon, he would begin to tire. And when that happens, we tend to let the world come to us. When we're young people, we dash out there and try to bring everything about and go out and get things. But if we're struggling with an adversary and our energy is waning, it's a pretty wise thing to look at what's happening with the adversary and take initiative or to act according to the weaknesses of the other. So you're taking the other into account, which is what happens after noon and until midnight. Until at midnight there is a very deep collapse. So from the sun we can sense the diurnal cycle, the circadian cycle of east and west. The same question arises again. Is there a similar purely astrological effect for the other planets? And once again, it seems that if there is, it's way too subtle to measure unless you're highly, highly sensitive. All of this means that we have to observe many horoscopes in many lives and try to see if there is a faint tendency to this. That's the only science that we have. The other option is to see other astrologers and see if they have found such a correlation. And after many years, I have concluded that the East and West test is a valid test and profile. But it is not as significant as the North and South test. At least it's not as obvious. And this is what other astrologers have come up with also. But I don't know, because I've never had enough time to dig in with other astrologers and see whether it is a matter of they're just carrying on a tradition or whether they have it from their own experience. Now, the value of astrology lies in its ability to focus on the individual. We can learn a lot of things by looking at many horoscopes and have a percentage understanding, but percentage understandings are not what people go to astrology for. If there's a 5% chance that you are likely to be in a catastrophic accident, you want to know whether you're in the 5% or in the 95%. You want to know that, you want to be the specific. And astrology can provide that kind of information with a lot of work and a lot of concentration and a lot of intuition. So relying on others isn't necessarily a full answer. So this is something we'll have to take this as a tentative working. For me, it's more than that because I've seen enough horoscopes to know. I've never checked it with the astrological database because that would be a huge, huge job. All right, it's time to apply this to the 2 horoscopes, but at this point I ran out of time making the notes, so you have a assignment. Your assignment is to apply the test and get a profile and any comments you may have, and then the next time we'll carry on, and I'm pretty sure that the next time that we will get the other tests done. But I'm having a good time getting into all sorts of things. That is, you know, I've always wanted to know why things are the way they are and why they work, if they work. And so I'm doing that. I'm going very slow. Maybe that's why we have so few people. We have to find people. It's going to be very hard to do this class. Questions? Okay. Look at that. Is this unbelievable?